The whispers followed Lady Eleanora Ainsworth like her own shadow, thin and persistent. They were the rustle of silk skirts turning away in a drawing room, the soft clink of a teacup set down with pointed finality, the barely audible sighs of pity that were sharper than any insult. Tonight, at her aunt's suffocatingly lavish ball, the whispers had a name and a face. Two, in fact, her cousins, Clara and Beatrice Finchley, resplendent in gowns of jewel-toned satin that made Eleanora's modest grey silk seem like a wisp of evening fog. "Poor Eleanora," Clara murmured behind her fan, her voice a confection of false sympathy. 27 and still unwed. And in that dress, it was fashionable a season ago, was it not? Beatrice, the crueler of the two, did not bother to hide her smirk. "One must make allowances, sister. When one's father gambles away a fortune, one cannot afford to keep up. It is a wonder Aunt Finchley allows her in society at all. An act of charity, I'm sure." Eleanora's spine stiffened, a column of pale marble against the gilded wallpaper. She did not turn. To acknowledge them would be to grant them victory. Instead, she fixed her gaze on a portrait of a stern-faced Finchley ancestor, pretending a sudden fascination with his formidable cravat. Her own circumstances were, as her cousins so delicately implied, dire. Upon her father's death 2 years prior, the ledgers had revealed a catastrophic ruin. The Ainsworth estate was sold, the London townhouse relinquished, and Eleanora was left with a pittance of an income and a name that was now more burden than boon. She was a guest in her aunt's house, a position that felt perilously close to that of an unpaid companion, subject to the whims and thinly veiled scorn of her relations. Her aunt, Lady Finchley, believed in strategic generosity, acts of kindness performed so publicly that they accrued social capital. Housing her impoverished niece was one such act. It allowed her to appear magnanimous while constantly reminding Eleanora of her dependency. Every meal was a gift, every invitation a debt. And the primary objective of this charity, as Lady Finchley had made clear in numerous excruciating conversations, was to see Eleanora married. Not well, for that ship had sailed with the family fortune, but married nonetheless. A country vicar, perhaps, a retired army captain with a modest pension, someone, anyone, to take the poor relation off her hands. The ballroom was a galaxy of glittering chandeliers and shimmering gowns, a cacophony of string music and polite laughter. Eleanora felt like a ghost haunting the edges of a feast, invisible to all but those who wished to point out her spectral presence. She had danced once, with a nervous young baron's son pushed into it by his mother, and had since retreated to the relative safety of an alcove near the ferns. It was from this vantage point that she first saw him, or rather, became aware of his presence, for one did not simply see the Duke of Blackwood. One felt his arrival as a subtle shift in the room's atmospheric pressure. The music seemed to quiet, the laughter to dip. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, stood near the grand archway, a figure carved from shadow and ice. He was impossibly tall, dressed in immaculate black that absorbed the light, making him a stark void in the colourful tableau. His face was a study in harsh, beautiful angles, a strong jaw, a straight nose, a mouth that looked as if it had never learned to smile. But it was his eyes that held the room captive. They were the grey of a winter sea, cold and deep and unreadable. He was the most desired and most feared bachelor in the ton. His wealth was legendary, his title ancient, but a tragedy cloaked him, a story told in hushed tones. His young wife had died years ago in a terrible accident, leaving him with a single, silent child. Since then, Blackwood had become a recluse, his heart supposedly buried with his duchess. His rare appearances in society were treated as major events, and every ambitious mother with a marriageable daughter would practically vibrate with a mixture of hope and terror in his presence. Tonight, he spoke to no one. He simply stood, a silent sentinel, his gaze sweeping the room with an unnerving lack of interest. It was a look that dismissed everyone and everything, a look of profound, unbridgeable distance. Eleonora watched him, not with the fluttering hope of her cousins, but with a strange, detached empathy. She, too, knew what it was to feel apart from the world, to stand on the outside looking in. His isolation was one of wealth and power. Hers was of poverty and shame. Yet the feeling, she suspected, was much the same. Her cousins had, of course, noticed him. "The Duke!" Beatrice hissed, her entire posture changing as she straightened her shoulders and angled her chin. "He is looking this way." "He is looking at the entire room, you ninny," Clara retorted, though she, too, was subtly repositioning herself, ensuring her best profile was on display. "They say he has not danced in 5 years. Imagine being the one to change that." Eleonora allowed herself a small, secret sigh. The machinations of the marriage market were exhausting to behold. She turned her attention back to the fern, tracing the delicate pattern of a frond with her eyes, when a sudden, collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd around her. The string quartet faltered for a moment, a single violin squeaking in surprise before catching up. The Duke of Blackwood was moving. He crossed the polished floor with a long, deliberate stride that parted the sea of guests. He was not heading for the dance floor, nor for the balcony, nor for the champagne fountain where the season's most celebrated beauties were gathered. He was walking directly toward her alcove. Eleonora's heart gave a painful, startled leap. It was impossible. He must be heading for someone, behind her, or perhaps seeking a moment of quiet. She pressed herself further into the shadows, wishing the potted palm were twice its size. But he did not stop. He came to a halt directly in front of her, his height eclipsing the candlelight, casting her in his formidable shadow. The whispers around them did not just cease. They were extinguished, sucked from the air by the sheer force of his presence. Clara and Beatrice were frozen, their mouths slightly agape, their fans stilled in their hands. Eleonora forced herself to meet his gaze. Up close, his eyes were even more startling. Not just cold, but haunted, filled with a sorrow so vast it seemed to have no end. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply looked at her, his expression an unreadable mask of aristocratic control. She could feel the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on them, could feel her aunt's imminent apoplexy from across the room. "Lady Eleonora Ainsworth," he said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, as devoid of warmth as his eyes. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. She found her own voice, surprised it came out as a steady, quiet murmur. "Your Grace." She executed a small, perfect curtsy, her years of breeding coming to her aid even as her pulse hammered against her ribs. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. He did not offer pleasantries. He did not ask to dance. He did not comment on the weather or the music. He looked at her as if she were a column in a ledger, a problem to be solved. And then, in that same cool, dispassionate voice, loud enough for all those nearby to hear, he said the words that shattered the world. "Madame, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The silence that followed was absolute, a ringing void where the music and chatter had been. Eleonora stared at him, certain she had misheard, that this was some cruel, elaborate jest. But his expression had not changed. It was unyielding, serious. Her cousins' faces were a comical tableau of shock and incandescent envy. Beatrice's fan had slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, the sound like a gunshot in the stillness. "Poor woman," they had whispered. The most powerful, most enigmatic, most desired duke in all of England had just proposed to her in front of them all. And as Eleonora looked into the chilling depths of his eyes, she knew, with a certainty that froze her to the very marrow, that this was not a rescue. It was a transaction, and the price was one she could not yet begin to comprehend. The hour that followed the Duke's proposal was a blur of surreal, disjointed moments. Lady Finchley, recovering from her near swoon, had descended upon them with the speed and ferocity of a hawk, her face a mask of triumphant disbelief. She had whisked the Duke away to her husband's study for a glass of brandy and a discussion of terms, a word that made Eleonora's stomach clench. Clara and Beatrice, their earlier scorn, transmuted into a venomous, disbelieving jealousy, had not spoken another word to her, communicating only through narrowed eyes and pinched lips. Eleonora had been guided to a small, stuffy sitting room to compose herself, though she felt strangely, unnaturally calm. It was the calm of a ship's captain who, having been dashed against the rocks, now simply floated amidst the wreckage, waiting to see if he would drift to shore or be pulled under. The door opened, and the Duke of Blackwood entered. He closed it behind him with a soft, definitive click, shutting out the muted sounds of the dying ball. The room was small, and his presence seemed to consume all the available air. He did not sit, but stood by the mantelpiece, one hand resting on the cool marble. The fire had burned down to embers, casting flickering, distorted shadows across his severe features. "Lady Eleonora," he began, his tone as formal and remote as it had been on the ballroom floor. "I trust your aunt has conveyed my intentions to you." "She conveyed that you have made a formal offer for my hand, Your Grace," Eleonora replied, her voice quiet but firm. She remained seated, her hands clasped in her lap to still their trembling. She would not be intimidated. She had nothing left to lose, which gave her a strange, fragile courage. "I have," he confirmed, "and I feel it is only right that you understand the precise nature of the arrangement before you accept." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, analytical and detached. "This is not a proposal of affection, madam. It is one of convenience, a contract." The word hung in the air between them, cold and sharp. Eleonora met his gaze without flinching. I had surmised as much. A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or respect, passed through his eyes before being extinguished. "Good. Then we need not waste time with false sentiment. My requirements are simple. I require a duchess. My estate, Blackwood Manor, needs a chatelaine. More importantly, my daughter requires a mother." At the mention of his daughter, his expression tightened almost imperceptibly, the mask cracking for a fraction of a second to reveal a raw, profound pain beneath. "Rosamond is 5 years old. She is delicate. She needs the stability and guidance that only a woman's presence can provide. You will be expected to oversee her governess, her education, and her general well-being." "And in return?" Eleonora asked, her voice a little breathless. "In return," he said, the words clipped and precise, "you will have the protection of my name. You will have a home. You will have unlimited funds at your disposal to run the household and to see to your own needs. Your financial difficulties, which I have taken the liberty of investigating, will be permanently resolved. You will want for nothing in a material sense. Your aunt and cousins will no longer have any power over you." He knew. Of course he knew. A man like him would leave nothing to chance. He had investigated her, assessed her situation, and identified her as a suitable candidate for his cold transaction. She was a woman of good breeding and impeccable reputation, with no meddling family to interfere and desperate enough to accept any terms. She was the perfect solution to his problem. "There are conditions, of course," he continued, his voice dropping slightly, becoming even more chillingly remote. "Our marriage will be in name only. You will have your own wing at Blackwood. I will have mine. We will present a united front in public as required by our station. We will dine together when convention demands it. But in private, we will lead separate lives. I will not be your companion, your confidant, or your lover. You will not ask for my affection, and I will not offer any. Is that understood?" Each word was a stone, building a wall between them. He was not just proposing a loveless marriage. He was engineering one, drafting its bylaws with the precision of a solicitor. He was offering her a gilded cage, a beautiful, empty prison. Eleonora thought of her life as it was. The daily humiliations, the cloying pity, the constant grinding worry about the future, the prospect of a dreary marriage to some half-pay officer who would see her as little more than a housekeeper. This duke was offering her an escape, a cold, lonely escape, but an escape nonetheless. She would have security. She would have a purpose, however circumscribed, a house to run, a child to care for, and she would have dignity. The Duchess of Blackwood was beholden to no one. "And your daughter?" she asked, the question rising unbidden. "Rosamond, you say she is delicate?" The Duke's jaw tightened. "She does not speak." The simple, devastating statement landed with more force than any of his previous conditions. Eleonora's breath caught in her throat. A silent child. The tragedy that cloaked him was darker than she had ever imagined. "I see," she said softly. He seemed to take her quiet response as an acceptance of the final, unspoken term, that she was not to pry into his past, into the source of his grief or his daughter's silence. "So," he said, pushing away from the mantelpiece, "do we have an agreement, Lady Eleonora?" She looked at this tall, handsome, broken man. He was offering her a life of immense privilege and profound loneliness. He was offering her everything she could want and nothing she truly needed. But need was a luxury she could no longer afford. Want had been extinguished long ago. All that was left was survival. Eleonora rose to her feet, her grey silk dress whispering in the quiet room. She stood as tall as she could, meeting his cold, winter-sea eyes without wavering. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, her voice clear and steady. "We have an agreement." The journey to Blackwood Manor was undertaken in a state of muted disbelief, a silent, 4-hour carriage ride that seemed to stretch across an entire lifetime. The Duke had departed London on urgent business the day after their betrothal was announced, leaving Eleonora to endure a week of her aunt's frantic wedding preparations and her cousin's barely concealed fury. Now, Travelling in the Duke's own carriage, a vehicle of such silent, sombre luxury, it felt more like a hearse. She was finally on her way to her new life. Her husband, the word felt foreign and absurd on her tongue, had not accompanied her. He had sent the carriage with a terse note explaining he would meet her at the manor that evening. It was a clear signal, the first of many, of the separate lives they were to lead. She was not a bride being escorted to her new home. She was a piece of cargo being delivered. As the carriage turned off the main road and onto a long, winding drive, the landscape began to change. The cheerful, sun-dappled fields of the south gave way to a wilder, more dramatic topography. Ancient oaks, their branches twisted into tormented shapes, stood sentinel on either side of the drive. A low mist clung to the ground, muffling the sound of the horses' hooves. It was beautiful, but in a severe, melancholic way. It was a landscape that matched its master. And then she saw it. Blackwood Manor rose from the mist like a jagged cliff face, a vast, sprawling edifice of grey stone, its many turrets and gables piercing the bruised twilight sky. It was not a welcoming place. It was a fortress, built to withstand a siege, both from without and within. Its windows were dark, watchful eyes, and the silence that surrounded it was profound, broken only by the cawing of a distant rook. The carriage drew to a halt before a set of massive oak doors. A footman hurried to lower the steps, and Eleonora alighted, her travelling cloak clutched tightly around her. The air was cold, carrying the damp scent of earth and stone. The doors swung open, and a woman stood silhouetted in the entrance hall. She was tall and severe, dressed in black bombazine, her grey hair pulled back into a tight, uncompromising bun. "Your Grace," the woman said, her voice crisp and emotionless as she dropped into a respectful curtsy. "I am Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. Welcome to Blackwood." Eleonora stepped inside, and the sheer scale of the entrance hall made her gasp. The ceiling soared 2 stories high, lost in shadow. A grand staircase of dark, polished wood curved up into the gloom. Portraits of grim-faced ancestors stared down from the walls, their eyes seeming to follow her. The air was still and frigid, carrying the faint, funereal scent of beeswax and old stone. There were no flowers, no welcoming fire in the enormous hearth, no sign of life beyond the stiffly waiting housekeeper. The house felt as if it were holding its breath. "The Duke is in his study. He has requested that you be shown to your rooms first to refresh yourself after your journey," Mrs. Gable stated. "He will join you for dinner at 8. It was another clear demarcation. Her arrival was a logistical event, not a personal one. "Thank you, Mrs. Gable," Eleonora said, her voice sounding small in the cavernous space. She followed the housekeeper up the grand staircase, their footsteps echoing on the marble. They passed down a long gallery, the Duke's ancestors watching their procession. Mrs. Gable stopped before a pair of carved doors at the end of a corridor. "This is the Duchess's wing, Your Grace." She opened the doors. "It has been prepared for you." The rooms were magnificent, a large sitting room decorated in shades of cream and gold, a cavernous bedchamber with a heavily draped 4-poster bed, and a dressing room larger than her entire bedroom at her aunt's house. The furniture was exquisite, the fabrics priceless, but like the rest of the manor, it was cold, impersonal. It felt like a suite in a grand, empty hotel. Her single trunk, containing all her worldly possessions, looked comically small and shabby, sitting in the middle of the vast Aubusson carpet. "Will there be anything else, Your Grace?" Mrs. Gable asked, her posture unbending. I should like to see Lady Rosamond, Eleonora said, correcting herself. The word daughter felt like a lie. The housekeeper's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Lady Rosamond is in the nursery. She keeps to her routine. Perhaps it would be best to meet her in the morning, after she has been prepared for the introduction. I would like to see her now, please, Eleonora insisted quietly. She would not begin her life here by being managed. The child was her charge, the one part of this cold bargain that involved a human heart. She would not neglect it. A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, crossed Mrs. Gable's face. Very well, Your Grace. She led Eleonora through a series of quieter, less grand corridors to another wing of the house. The nursery was a large, airy room, but a profound silence emanated from it. Inside, a governess with a pinched face sat sewing by the window, and in the center of the room, a small girl sat on the floor, surrounded by toys she was not playing with. This was Rosamond. She was as delicate and beautiful as a porcelain doll, with a cloud of dark curls that fell to her shoulders and eyes the exact same shade of stormy grey as her father's. She was dressed in a pristine white frock, and she was utterly, unnervingly still. She was not building with the wooden blocks, nor cuddling the stuffed bear, nor looking at the picture book open beside her. She was simply staring at a single point on the far wall, her small face a perfect, blank mask. She did not look up when they entered. Lady Rosamond, the governess said, her voice sharp. The new Duchess is here to see you. Stand and make your curtsy. The child did not move. She gave no sign that she had heard. Eleonora's heart ached. This was the delicate child, the silent girl at the heart of this silent house. She felt a wave of protective pity so strong it nearly buckled her knees. She ignored the governess and slowly knelt on the floor, a few feet away from the child, so as not to startle her. Hello, Rosamond, she said softly. My name is Eleonora. It's a very great pleasure to meet you. Rosamond's gaze did not waver from the wall. She was in a world of her own, a fortress as impenetrable as the one her father had built around his heart. Eleonora stayed there for a long moment, simply breathing the same quiet air as the child, letting her presence be known without demanding a response. This was not a challenge to be won in a day. This was a long, patient siege. Finally, she rose. Thank you, Miss Finch, she said to the governess, making a mental note of the woman's cold demeanor. I will see her in the morning. As she walked back to her own empty, opulent rooms, the full weight of her new reality settled upon her. She was the Duchess of Blackwood, mistress of a house that felt like a mausoleum, wife to a man who was a stranger, and mother to a child locked in a silent prison of her own. She had escaped one cage only to find herself in another, infinitely larger and more desolate. The only question was whether it was possible, in this cold and silent place, to find a flicker of warmth, a single note of life. Looking at the grim portraits on the wall, she felt the answer was a resounding no. The first weeks at Blackwood Manor passed in a haze of cold formality and echoing silence. Eleonora's life was governed by a rigid, unspoken routine. She breakfasted alone in a small, sunless morning room. She spent her days familiarizing herself with the vast, labyrinthine house, speaking with Mrs. Gable about inventories and menus, and attempting to breach the silent walls of the nursery. Dinner was the only time she saw her husband. These meals were excruciating affairs, conducted in a dining hall so vast their two seats at opposite ends of the long, polished table felt miles apart. The Duke would inquire politely about her day. She would respond with equal, distant civility. They spoke of the weather, of estate matters, of neutral, bloodless topics that required no opinion and revealed no emotion. He would look at her with his unreadable grey eyes, and she would see the profound weariness in them, the carefully banked grief that never quite went away. He was meticulously polite, unfailingly correct. He fulfilled his part of the bargain to the letter, and it was, in its own way, a kind of torture. The silence of a room was less lonely than the silence that sat between two people. Her time with Rosamond was equally challenging. The child continued to exist in her own impenetrable world. Eleonora dismissed the cold, impatient governess, Miss Finch, and took over much of the girl's care herself, a decision that earned a raised eyebrow from Mrs. Gable, but no comment from the Duke. She read stories to Rosamond, whose eyes remained fixed on the middle distance. She took her for walks in the formal, manicured gardens, the little girl's hand lying limp and unresponsive in her own. She brushed her dark, silky hair, humming soft lullabies. She received nothing in return, no glance, no sound, no sign of recognition. It was like tending to a beautiful, sleeping doll. Yet Eleonora persisted. This quiet, constant care was her anchor in this strange, cold life. It was a purpose. It was during one of her solitary explorations of the grounds that she found it. Tucked away behind a high stone wall, almost completely obscured by overgrown ivy, was a heavy, iron-bound wooden door. It was locked, but the key, rusted and ancient, was still in the lock. With a great deal of effort, she managed to turn it. The door creaked open, complaining loudly, to reveal a scene of breathtaking neglect. It was a walled garden, or it had been. Now it was a wild, chaotic tangle of thorns and weeds. A stone sundial in the center was green with moss, its face illegible. A flagstone path was almost entirely consumed by grass. Rose bushes, unpruned for what must have been years, had grown into monstrous, thorny beasts, their few desperate blooms small and pale. In the center, a small stone fountain was choked with dead leaves, its cherubic statue staring up at the sky with a grimy, mournful expression. But despite the decay, there was a sense of peace here, a feeling of forgotten beauty. The high walls offered shelter from the wind, and the southern exposure meant the sun, when it appeared, fell warmly within its confines. It was a secret, hidden place, a place that had once been loved and then abandoned. Like the house, like the family within it. An idea began to form in Eleonora's mind, a small, stubborn seed of purpose. She would bring this garden back to life. It was a task of her own choosing, something that had nothing to do with being a duchess or fulfilling a contract. It would be hers. The next morning, she sought out the head gardener, a craggy, stooped man named Mr. Davies, whose surprise at seeing the new duchess in his potting shed was almost comical. "I require a set of gardening gloves, a trowel, and a pair of shears," she announced, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Mr. Davies stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. "For you, Your Grace?" "Yes, for me," she confirmed. "I intend to restore the old walled garden behind the west wing." The man's expression shifted from surprise to something akin to alarm. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, but no one has gone in there for years. Not for a very long time. The Duke, he doesn't—" He trailed off, looking deeply uncomfortable. "The Duke has not forbidden it," Eleonora said, a statement that was technically true. Please, Mr. Davies, the tools. Reluctantly, he provided them. And so, her work began. Every morning, after her solitary breakfast and her silent hour with Rosamond, Eleonora would change from her stiff morning gowns into the oldest, most practical dress she owned and make her way to the secret garden. The work was hard, far harder than she had anticipated. Her hands, accustomed only to needlework and the turning of pages, were soon blistered and sore, despite the thick gloves. Her back ached from hours of bending and pulling at stubborn, deep-rooted weeds. She wrestled with the thorny, overgrown rose bushes, trimming them back with a ferocity that surprised her. She cleared the dead leaves from the fountain and scrubbed the grime from the little stone cherub. Slowly, painstakingly, inch by inch, she began to reclaim the garden from the wilderness. She felt a grim satisfaction in the physical labor. The ache in her muscles was a welcome distraction from the ache in her heart. The dirt under her fingernails was proof of a day spent in useful, tangible effort. Here, her actions had immediate, visible results, unlike her efforts with the silent child or the distant duke. She knew she was being watched. From the tall, mullioned windows of the duke's study, which overlooked this part of the estate, she would sometimes feel a presence. She never looked up, never acknowledged him. She simply continued her work, her focus absolute. Let him watch. This was her territory. One afternoon, as she was trying to dislodge a heavy, moss-covered flagstone that had been pushed up by a thick root, she heard a footstep behind her. She turned, startled, to find the Duke standing there. He was dressed for riding, his tall boots dusty, but his face was, as always, an impassive mask. He looked from her dirt-streaked face to the piles of weeds and pruned branches, his gaze sweeping over the small area she had managed to clear. Eleonora's heart hammered. She expected a reprimand, an order to cease this foolishness, to remember her place. She braced herself for the cold, cutting words. He said nothing. He simply walked over to the flagstone that had defeated her, bent down, and with one smooth, powerful motion lifted it and set it back into its proper place. Then he straightened up, gave her a single, unreadable look, and walked away, without a word. Eleonora stared after him, her trowel hanging forgotten in her hand. It was not kindness, not precisely. It was not praise. But it was not a prohibition either. It was a neutral, practical act. And it was the first time he had ever done anything for her that was not explicitly required by their contract. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible crack in the wall of ice between them, a single, solitary glimmer of something she could not yet name. Later that day, from the corner of her eye, she saw a small face watching her from an upstairs window. It was Rosamond, and for the first time the child's gaze was not fixed on the empty distance, but on her. The small, silent acknowledgments from the Duke and his daughter became a quiet rhythm in Eleonora's life. Alistair never mentioned the garden again, but occasionally a new tool she needed would appear by the door in the morning, or a particularly stubborn patch of ivy would be gone, cleared by a stronger hand than her own. And Rosamond was now a frequent, silent observer at the nursery window. She would watch, her small face pressed against the glass as Eleonora worked below. It was a fragile, tentative connection, a thread of shared observation in a house of echoing voids, and Eleonora cherished it. The garden itself was responding to her care. The rose bushes, brutally pruned, were now covered in healthy new growth. She had cleared the paths and weeded the beds, discovering the ghostly outlines of a once beautiful design. Hardy perennials, long dormant, were beginning to push new green shoots through the dark, rich earth. It was becoming a place of hope. This fragile peace was shattered by the arrival of a letter bearing the ostentatious Finchley crest. Her aunt, having allowed a suitable period for Eleonora to settle in, was now inviting herself, along with Clara and Beatrice, to visit Blackwood Manor. "We are all so eager to see you in your new home, dearest Eleonora, and to finally make the acquaintance of the dear Duke and his sweet child," she wrote, her words dripping with a saccharine insincerity that made Eleonora's teeth ache. A wave of dread washed over her, the thought of her aunt's critical eye sweeping over the cold grandeur of Blackwood, of her cousin's sharp, jealous whispers echoing in these silent halls, was unbearable. This place was her sanctuary, however strange and lonely. The Finchleys represented the world she had escaped, a world of judgment, pity, and scorn. She had no choice but to accept. To refuse would be a declaration of war, an insult her aunt would never forgive, and a topic of gossip for the entire ton. She informed the Duke of the impending visit at dinner that evening, her voice tight with apprehension. "My aunt, Lady Finchley, and my cousins wish to visit," she said, folding the letter with stiff fingers. Alistair looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. "When do they arrive?" "Next Tuesday, to stay for 2 nights. He gave a curt nod. "Mrs. Gable will see to the arrangements, inform her of their needs." And that was all. He offered no words of comfort, no acknowledgement of her distress. As far as he was concerned, it was a simple matter of household logistics. He did not understand that for Eleonora, this was not a visit. It was an invasion. The day of their arrival dawned grey and oppressive, the sky a low, bruised ceiling of cloud. Eleonora felt a familiar tension coiling in her stomach as she waited in the entrance hall. The Finchley carriage arrived precisely on time, a garish yellow monstrosity that looked absurdly cheerful against the grim stone of the manor. Her aunt swept in first, a whirlwind of lavender silk and cloying perfume, embracing Eleonora with a theatrical flourish. "My dearest girl, a duchess! Who would have ever believed it?" she exclaimed, her voice loud enough to make the ancestors in the portraits flinch. Clara and Beatrice followed, their eyes wide as they took in the scale of the hall. Their expressions were a sour cocktail of envy and resentment. Their greetings were cool, their compliments on the house double-edged. "It is all so grand, Eleonora," Clara said, running a gloved finger over a marble statue. "And so very quiet." The visit was an exercise in torment. Lady Finchley interrogated Mrs. Gable about the running of the household, offering unsolicited advice. Clara and Beatrice wandered through the staterooms, making quiet, critical comparisons to other, warmer, ducal homes. They treated Eleonora with a new, faintly mocking deference, calling her "Your Grace," with an exaggerated emphasis that was a constant reminder of her improbable change in station. Eleonora endured it all with a quiet, practiced dignity. She was the Duchess of Blackwood now. Their petty barbs could not truly harm her, but her real fear was for Rosamond. She tried to keep the child separate, but her aunt insisted on meeting the dear little thing. The confrontation happened in the drawing-room before dinner on the second day. Eleonora had brought Rosamond down, hoping a brief, formal introduction would satisfy them. The child was silent and still as always, a tiny, perfect statue in a velvet dress, her hand clutching Eleonora's. Lady Finchley cooed at her. "What a precious child, but so shy. Has the cat got your tongue, little one?" Rosamond, predictably, did not respond. She stared past them all, her grey eyes fixed on some invisible point. Beatrice leaned forward, her voice a cruel, conspiratorial whisper. "They say she is not right in the head, Mamma, that she has been silent since the first Duchess. Well, you know." Clara chimed in, her expression one of mock pity. "How dreadful, to be saddled with such a peculiar child. Poor Eleonora, your duties must be so trying." Something inside Eleonora snapped. The weeks of patient endurance, the years of swallowing their casual cruelty, it all fell away. A cold, clear anger rose in her, sharp and clean as ice. She put a protective arm around Rosamond's small shoulders. "My duties, as you call them, are a privilege, cousin," she said, her voice low and dangerously calm. "And Rosamond is not peculiar. She is a child who has known great sorrow, something your shallow hearts could not possibly comprehend." She looked directly at Beatrice, her gaze unwavering. "And if you ever speak of her or her mother in that tone again in this house, you will be asked to leave." The room fell into a stunned silence. Lady Finchley's jaw dropped. Clara and Beatrice stared at her, utterly aghast. Eleonora, the poor relation, the quiet mouse, had just shown the steel of a duchess. It was at that precise moment that the Duke of Blackwood entered the room. He had been coming from his study and had clearly overheard the entire exchange. He stopped just inside the doorway, his tall frame filling the space, his face a thunderous mask. He looked at his silent daughter, at Eleonora's protective stance, and at the shocked, malevolent faces of the Finchleys. His gaze settled on Lady Finchley. "It appears my wife has already made her wishes clear," he said, his voice soft but laced with menace. "Allow me to reiterate them. Your visit is at an end. My carriage will be ready in 10 minutes. It was a dismissal of absolute, unquestionable finality. He had not raised his voice. He had not argued. He had simply passed sentence." Lady Finchley sputtered, her face turning a mottled red. "Your Grace, I assure you, it was a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," he cut in, his voice like the crack of a whip. "You have insulted my daughter and my wife under my roof. 10 minutes. He did not wait for a reply. He turned and walked out, the silence he left behind more damning than any tirade. The Finchleys departed in a flurry of indignant, flustered haste, their grand visit cut ignominiously short. Eleonora stood in the drawing-room, her arm still around Rosamond, her heart pounding with the aftermath of the confrontation. She had defended this child, this house, as her own, and her husband, the cold, distant stranger, had stood with her. He had seen her act of loyalty, and he had allied himself with her against the outside world. For the first time since she had arrived at Blackwood, they had not been two separate entities sharing a space. They had been a united front. The wall of ice had not simply cracked, a stone had been dislodged, leaving a gaping hole through which something new and unfamiliar might pass. The expulsion of the Finchleys left a strange, vibrating silence in its wake. The oppressive weight of their presence was gone, but in its place was a new, uncertain tension. Eleonora had acted on pure instinct, a fierce, protective impulse that had surprised even herself. Alistair's swift, decisive support had been even more shocking. He had defended her. He had called her his wife, not as a title, but as a statement of allegiance. That evening, dinner was a quiet, charged affair. The great dining hall felt smaller, the distance between them less vast. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with unspoken words. Eleonora kept glancing at her husband, trying to read his expression, but the mask was firmly back in place. Yet something had irrevocably shifted between them. The shared challenge had forged a fragile, temporary bridge across the chasm of their arrangement. The true aftermath of the visit became apparent the next day. Rosamond, who had weathered the incident with her usual unnerving stillness, was now withdrawn in a way Eleonora had not seen before. She would not leave the nursery. She refused to eat. She sat in a small chair in the corner, her hands clenched into tiny fists in her lap, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to look inward, at some memory Eleonora could not see. The doctor was summoned, a portly, well-meaning man who clucked his tongue, prescribed a calming tonic, and spoke of childish humours. But Eleonora knew it was more than that. The cruelty of her cousin's words had struck some deep, hidden wound. For 2 days she sat with the child, trying to soothe her. She spoke softly, she sang, she held her hand, but Rosamond remained locked in her terrified trance. On the 3rd morning, desperate, Eleonora had a new idea. She wrapped the little girl in a warm shawl, lifted her into her arms, and carried her out of the suffocating stillness of the nursery, out of the great, gloomy house, and into the fresh air. She carried her to the one place that felt like her own, the one place that was coming back to life. She carried her to the walled garden. She sat on a newly repaired stone bench, holding Rosamond on her lap. The garden was a testament to her weeks of labour. The first of the roses were beginning to bloom, small, courageous buds of pale pink and creamy white. Bees hummed amongst the lavender she had planted, and the little stone cherub in the fountain, now clean, seemed to smile in the dappled sunlight. "Look, Rosamond," Eleonora whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Look what we've done. It was all so sad and tangled before, but now it's starting to be beautiful again." She pointed to a tenacious white rose climbing the grey stone wall. "Even when things seem broken, they can heal, they can grow again." She spoke for a long time, not to the child, but with her, sharing the quiet peace of the garden. She told her about the different flowers, about the stubborn roots she had dug up, about the robin that had built a nest in the old ivy. And as she spoke, she felt the tension in Rosamond's small body begin to ease ever so slightly. She did not know how long they had been sitting there when she became aware of another presence. Alistair was standing at the entrance to the garden, watching them. His face was etched with a pain so raw and profound it stole her breath. He looked at his daughter in her arms, at the blooming roses, at the resurrected garden, and his carefully constructed composure finally, devastatingly, crumbled. He walked slowly towards them, his footsteps silent on the new grass path. He stopped before the bench, his shadow falling over them. "This was her garden," he said, his voice rough, choked with a grief he had held in for years. "Isabella's. She loved it more than any room in the house." Eleonora looked up at him, her heart aching with a sudden, painful understanding. This was the source. This place. "She was here," he continued, his gaze lost in the past. "The day of the accident. She was pregnant. With our son. She was reaching for a rose, high on the wall. She slipped on the wet stones. She fell." His voice broke. I was in my study. I heard her cry out. He sank down onto the bench beside Eleonora, his head in his hands. The great, powerful Duke of Blackwood was utterly undone. The fall, it brought on the labor. The doctors couldn't stop it. The baby, he didn't survive. And Isabella, she contracted a fever. She was gone within a week. He looked up, his eyes swimming with unshed tears, the grey of a storm-tossed sea. I blamed myself. I should have been with her. I should have fixed the loose stone she tripped on. I should have done something. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path down his stone-like cheek. I closed this place up. I couldn't bear to look at it. I locked it away, just as I locked everything else away. I thought if I didn't feel it, the grief would die. But it didn't. It just festered. He turned his gaze to his daughter, who was still nestled in Eleonora's arms, watching him with wide, silent eyes. Rosamond saw it, he whispered, the words a final, terrible confession. She was just a toddler, playing near the fountain. She saw her mother fall. She saw the blood. She hasn't spoken a word since that day. The entire, heartbreaking truth was finally laid bare. The silent child, the grieving husband, the neglected garden. They were all pieces of the same shattering tragedy. His coldness wasn't cruelty. It was a shield. His distance was self-preservation, a desperate attempt to contain a grief so immense he feared it would consume him. And she, Eleonora, had unwittingly walked into the heart of his pain and, with her simple, patient care, had begun to let the light in. She didn't offer platitudes or empty words of comfort. She simply reached out her free hand and laid it gently on his arm. It was a small gesture, a quiet acknowledgement of his immense pain. He didn't pull away. He leaned into the touch, just slightly, a man adrift at sea, finally finding a piece of solid ground. In the quiet of the resurrected garden, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, the three of them sat together, a broken family taking the first tentative step toward healing. The confession in the garden shattered the foundations of their arrangement. The carefully constructed walls of formality and distance, already weakened, came tumbling down. In their place was a raw, fragile vulnerability. Alistair had shared the source of his deepest wound, and in doing so, had entrusted Eleonora with a piece of his soul. It was a trust she had no intention of betraying. That evening, a storm broke over Blackwood, a wild, elemental fury of wind and rain that seemed to mirror the emotional tempest that had been unleashed. The house, usually so silent, was filled with the howl of the wind in the chimneys and the drumming of rain against the window panes. Eleonora, unable to settle, found herself in the library. The vast book-lined room was dark, save for a roaring fire in the hearth that cast dancing shadows across the shelves. She stood before the window, watching the storm, her thoughts a whirlwind. I could not sleep. Alistair's voice, quiet and close behind her, made her jump. She turned to find him standing there, his cravat loosened, his hair slightly dishevelled. The formal Duke was gone, replaced by a man who looked weary and exposed. "Nor I," she admitted softly. He came to stand beside her at the window. For a long time, they watched the rain lashing against the glass in a comfortable silence. The pretense between them was gone. There was no need for the polite, empty conversation that had once defined their interactions. "Thank you," he said finally, his gaze still fixed on the storm outside, "for what you did today, for what you have been doing since you arrived." He turned to face her, his eyes dark and serious in the firelight. "You have brought a gentleness to this house, to Rosamond. I had forgotten what that was like." "She is a wonderful child," Eleonora said. "She only needs patience and love." "You have given her both," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "When I made my proposal in London, it was the most selfish act of my life. I needed a solution to a problem. I saw you, a woman of grace and dignity, trapped in an untenable situation. I thought we could be useful to one another. A simple, cold transaction." He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking, charged with a new energy. "I was a fool." He reached out and gently cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. His touch was warm, hesitant, electric. "I did not account for your strength, your compassion, your spirit. I watched you in the garden, day after day, bringing life back to a place I had tried to kill. You did not do it for me. You did it because it was in your nature to heal things, to nurture them." Eleonora's breath caught in her throat. His proximity, the warmth of his hand, the intensity of his gaze. It was overwhelming. She had spent so long interpreting his micro-expressions, his guarded glances, and now, here he was, laying his heart bare. "Alistair," she whispered, using his name for the first time. The sound of it on her lips seemed to be the final key. He lowered his head, his gaze dropping to her mouth. The world narrowed to the space between them, the firelight, the sound of the storm, the beat of her own heart. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his eyes asking a question she answered by leaning into his touch. And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of wild, unrestrained passion, but something far more profound. It was tender, searching, a kiss full of gratitude and sorrow and a desperate, burgeoning hope. It spoke of years of loneliness and the first, hesitant promise of connection. Eleonora felt her own carefully guarded heart, the one she had, thought long since dormant, unfurl in response. She lifted her hands to his chest, her fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt, and kissed him back with all the quiet longing she had held inside for a lifetime. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Eleonora," he murmured, the name a prayer. A soft knock at the library door shattered the spell. They sprang apart as Mrs. Gable entered, her face etched with a rare, flustered excitement. Your Grace," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed them both. "It's Lady Rosamond. She had a nightmare. She was crying out. I went to her and she spoke." Eleonora's heart stopped. What did she say? Mrs. Gable's stern face broke into a watery smile. "She asked for you, Your Grace," she said, her gaze fixed on Eleonora. "The word she said, it was Mama." The storm outside raged on, but inside the library, within the walls of Blackwood Manor, the long winter was finally over. The turning point had come, not with a clash of thunder, but with a single whispered word from a child, a word that promised a new beginning, a real family, a future they had never dared to imagine. The morning after the storm was bright and clean, the world washed new. The sunlight that streamed through the tall windows of Blackwood Manor seemed to have a different quality, warmer and more hopeful than before. The air in the house, once so still and heavy, felt lighter. Everything had changed. Eleonora woke in her own vast bed, but the memory of Alistair's kiss, the feel of his hand on her cheek, was as vivid as if he was still there. And the news of Rosamond's spoken word was a miracle. a seismic shift that had reordered their universe. Mama. The child had claimed her. She dressed quickly and went not to the morning room, but straight to the nursery. She found Rosamond sitting up in her bed, her dark curls tousled from sleep. The child looked at her as she entered, and for the first time her eyes were not distant or vacant. They were present, aware. Eleonora sat on the edge of the bed. "Good morning, my sweet girl," she said softly, her heart aching with a fierce, protective love. Rosamond looked at her, her small lips parting. There was a long, hesitant pause, and then, in a tiny, rusty voice, she said it again. "Mama." Tears sprang to Eleonora's eyes. She gathered the little girl into her arms, burying her face in her soft hair, holding her tight. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated joy, a reward for all the silent, patient days. She was so absorbed in the moment that she didn't hear Alistair enter. He stood in the doorway, watching them, his face a canvas of complex emotions, wonder, relief, and a deep, soul-shaking love. When Eleonora looked up and saw him, their eyes met over Rosamond's head, and a perfect, unspoken understanding passed between them. Later that morning, he sought her out. She was not in the house, but in the garden, her sanctuary. The storm had knocked some petals from the roses, but the plants themselves were strong and vibrant, their roots deep in the earth she had tended. She was kneeling by a bed of lavender, her hands cupped to inhale the clean, calming scent, when he came to her. He did not speak from a distance. He came and knelt beside her in the dirt, a duke unconcerned with soiling the knee of his perfectly tailored trousers. "Eleonora," he began, his voice low and earnest. "We need to talk." She turned to face him, her heart beating a steady, hopeful rhythm. "Alistair, what I offered you in London," he said, "was a contract, a business arrangement. I offered you a title and security, and in return I asked you to be a mother to my child and a duchess for my name. I asked you to accept a life without love, without companionship, without joy." He reached out and took her hands in his. Her fingers were smudged with earth, his were clean and strong. "I was wrong. Wrong to ask it of you, and wrong to think it was all I was capable of offering. For 5 years I have been a ghost in my own home, a custodian of my own grief. I thought my heart was buried with Isabella. I thought love was a chapter of my life that was over." He looked around the garden, at the blooming flowers, the clear sunlight. "But you walked into this house of shadows, and you stubbornly, quietly, began to plant flowers. You tended to my silent daughter. You tended to this broken garden. You tended to me, though I gave you no reason to. You showed me that things can grow again, even after the harshest winter." His grip on her hands tightened. His grey eyes, once so cold, were now filled with a warmth that made her soul sing. "The terms of our arrangement are no longer acceptable to me," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I do not want a duchess in name only. I do not want separate wings and polite dinners. I want a wife, a partner, a companion. I want to share my life with you, Eleonora, the joys and the sorrows. I want to build a real family with you and Rosamond." He took a deep breath, his vulnerability a gift more precious than any jewel. "I have fallen in love with your courage, your kindness, your indomitable spirit. I love you." The words she had never, ever expected to hear from him hung in the sunlit air, beautiful and perfect. Tears welled in her eyes once more, but this time they were tears of pure, unalloyed happiness. My proposal in your aunt's ballroom was a public spectacle born of private desperation, he said, a wry, self-deprecating twist to his lips, the first hint of humor she had ever seen from him. I would like to try again. He released one of her hands, but only to shift his position, going down on one knee before her on the soft grass path. The Duke of Blackwood, kneeling in the dirt of the garden, she had restored. Lady Eleanora Ainsworth, Duchess of Blackwood, he said, his voice shaking just slightly with the force of his emotion. Will you do me the profound honor of being my wife, in truth, in heart, and in every way that matters? She looked at this man, no longer a cold, remote figure of tragedy, but a man of strength and feeling who had fought his way back to the light. She looked at the garden around them, a symbol of their shared journey from desolation to hope. Yes, she whispered, the word catching in her throat. Oh, Alistair, yes. He rose and drew her into his arms, and his kiss was no longer hesitant or searching. It was a kiss of certainty, of homecoming, a passionate declaration of a love that had been hard-won and was all the more precious for it. As he held her, the sound of a child's happy laughter drifted from an open window of the house, a bright, clear sound that promised a beautiful future. 1 year later, the garden at Blackwood Manor was in its full, triumphant glory. It was a riot of colour and scent, a testament to what patience and care could achieve. The roses climbed the walls in a profusion of pink, white, and crimson. The fountain gurgled merrily, its cherub presiding over a scene of vibrant life. It was no longer a secret, neglected place, but the beating heart of the home. Eleanor sat on the stone bench, her lap full of flowers she had been gathering for the dining hall table. She was no longer the pale, haunted woman in a drab grey dress. Her cheeks had a healthy bloom, and her eyes, once filled with a quiet resignation, now shone with a deep, abiding happiness. A small, contented smile played on her lips as she watched her family. Alistair was chasing a laughing, chattering Rosamond across the lawn. The little girl, now 6, was a whirlwind of energy, her dark curls flying behind her as she shrieked with delight. Her silence was a distant memory, replaced by a constant stream of questions, stories, and songs. She was a happy, thriving child, healed by the steady, unconditional love of the woman she called Mama. Her husband was a changed man. The harsh lines of grief on his face had softened, replaced by the laughter lines crinkling at the corners of his eyes. The cold, remote Duke was gone forever, and in his place was Alistair, a warm, attentive husband and a devoted, playful father. He caught Rosamond and swung her high into the air, her peals of laughter echoing in the warm summer air. He set her down and walked over to Eleanora, his expression full of a love so profound it still sometimes took her breath away. He sat beside her, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Are you happy?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. It was a question he asked often, as if he still couldn't quite believe their good fortune. "Immeasurably," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. She placed a hand on her own gently rounded stomach, where their child, a new life, was growing. "Look at what we have built." He followed her gaze from their vibrant daughter to the magnificent garden, to the great house that was no longer a fortress of sorrow, but a warm, welcoming home filled with light and laughter. "No," he said softly, his arm tightening around her. "Look at what you have built, Eleanora. You came into the darkness and taught us all how to live again." The whispers that had once followed her were long gone, replaced by the sweet murmurings of a loving family. The pitying glances had vanished, replaced by the adoring gaze of her husband and child. She had been the poor woman, the impoverished relation with no prospects. And in a way, they had been right. She had been poor, but not in coin. She had been poor in hope, in love, in joy. Now she was the wealthiest woman in the world. Alistair leaned in and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of sunshine and roses and the promise of a lifetime of happy years to come. In the heart of their restored garden, surrounded by the family she had healed and the love she had nurtured, the Duchess of Blackwood was finally, truly home. Dear listener, isn't it remarkable how the quietest actions can cause the loudest revolutions in a human heart? Eleonora's story is a beautiful reminder that true strength isn't always found in grand declarations or defiant stands. Sometimes it's in the patient, persistent act of tending to a neglected garden, whether that garden is made of soil and thorns or of the tangled, overgrown sorrow in another person's soul. We all encounter walled-off, forgotten places in our own lives and in the lives of those around us. We see people who, like Alistair, have built fortresses of ice around their pain, who keep the world at a safe, cold distance because they fear that to feel anything at all would be to feel too much. Our first instinct might be to turn away from that coldness, to seek out easier, sunnier company. Or, like Eleonora's cousins, we might judge it, whisper about it, and label it as peculiar or broken. But Eleonora chose a different path. She didn't try to storm the castle walls or demand entry into Alistair's locked-away grief. She simply found a small, neglected patch of earth and began to work. With her own hands, she cleared the weeds, pruned the dead branches, and let the light in. It was an act of faith. She believed that life was still dormant under the surface, waiting for a little care to be coaxed back into bloom. And in healing the garden, she created a safe space where a wounded family could begin to heal as well. How many neglected gardens do we walk past every day? A colleague who is quiet and withdrawn, a family member who has grown distant, or even that walled-off part of our own heart where we've buried our own disappointments and griefs. Eleonora's story teaches us that we don't need a grand plan to make a difference. We can simply start by pulling one weed, by offering a quiet word of kindness, by performing a small, unheralded act of service, by choosing compassion over judgment. Her love story with Alistair wasn't born from a lightning bolt of passion, but from the slow, steady accumulation of these quiet acts. He fell in love not with the Duchess, but with the woman who knelt in the dirt, the woman who fiercely defended his silent child, the woman who had the strength to see the man behind the mask. So, the next time you feel powerless in the face of someone's sorrow or your own, remember the lesson of the walled garden. Be patient, be persistent. Do the small, quiet work of nurturing. You may be astonished at the beauty that is just waiting to bloom, and the love that can grow in the most unexpected of places. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who might need a reminder that even the longest winter eventually gives way to spring.